Welcome to this SBC Task Force meeting. We will be having a very interesting presentation about incorporating the elements of behavioral economics into SBC design. My name is Lauren Jessup, and I will be doing a lot of the tech support for this meeting. I am the Program Associate for the TOPS program. If everyone can hear me and indicate that, that would be great right now, just so that we can make sure that everyone's audio is working. If you have any questions at all throughout the meeting, or if you're having any sort of technical problems, please indicate it in the chat box, and I will do my best to assist you. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat box, and then I will be sure to have our presenters answer them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our facilitator, Ashley, so that she can get this meeting started.
Hi, yes. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, super duper. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, welcome. We're excited for the meeting today and glad you could join us. The meeting today, just as a reminder for people who are new, what we try to do together is to develop and reach consensus on and build capacity in the state-of-the-art SBC standards and tools to improve the quality of food security programs. We are always looking for folks to get engaged, and we're very happy to have you all on the call. We're going to first start, as we always do, with a little welcome, and we ask everyone on the call to introduce yourself and tell us something about what are you folks working on, what are you reading, what challenges you're facing related to SBC, and then we're going to have a great presentation from Elizabeth Long with plenty of discussion, and then we'll wrap up with a little update on the work plan and any announcements that we or other people might have. Okay, so let's get started. Who would like to start? What's new with you and what are you reading and thinking about?
Mary, and I'm not sure we've opened, sure, I'll go ahead. I'm not sure we've given everybody microphone privileges either. It's kind of a larger group today. Lauren, what are we going to do about that? Should we give them microphone privileges? Okay.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if people are interested in just giving us a quick intro and what are they thinking about. I think that'd be fine. But yeah, let's keep it succinct because we do have a great group today.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and start since I've got the microphone open. So I'm Mary DeCoster. I co-chair this group with Ashley. I'm the SBC Senior Specialist at the TOPS program, and TOPS convenes the Food Security and Nutrition Network, so that's the connection with TOPS. One thing that's new with me is that Claire and I have been working the last few months on a new Resilience Associates Award, sort of trying to do some linkages of SBC and resilience work, so that's in addition to the work we were already doing on the TOPS program, so that's kind of fun. And what I'm reading, I am rereading, I don't think I finished it the first time through, but I'm rereading Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And I am also reading a really fascinating book on resilience, the social roots of risk, producing disasters, promoting resilience by Kathleen Tierney. So that's what I'm reading. Who's ready to open?
Interrupt. So just so everyone knows, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Adobe Connect, but at the top of your screen you should see a green speaker, and right to the right of that you'll see a little microphone. And if you would like to speak out, please click on that green microphone so that it turns green. And then you should be able to speak out. After you're done speaking, please click on that microphone again so that you're able to mute yourself.
Hi, this is Amy. I can go first since if we just want to go down the participant list alphabetically. My name is Amy Ostrander. I'm a technical advisor, food, nutrition, and livelihood security at PCI. I've most recently been working on projects in Guatemala on market-based interventions and cash and vouchers, which has been really fun and interesting. Haven't been doing as much SBCC recently. But I am reading Making It Stick by Dan and Chip Heath, which is a bit older. Several of you have probably read it, but I've never gotten around to it, about crafting messages that are memorable.
I'm going to just jump in and say, lately I've been reading, I think not everybody has to do both. What's new with you? What are you working on? What are you reading? And not everybody has to speak at all, but just, you know, maybe if a few of us pop in and if you're working on something really interesting. I've been reading a lot lately about Cambridge Analytica, this firm that helped the both in the Trump campaign and in the Brexit campaign in England, and they do micro-targeting of information based on personality types, which they construct from social media use. And I think I'm really interested because it seems like it's pretty effective, but of course there are some ethical questions and considerations. So that's what I've been thinking about lately. Do we just want to go down the participant list as Amy suggested? Anybody just raise your hand if you're interested in sharing. Share?
I think some people are typing into the chat box. Right. If you don't know how to raise your hand, there's a little person up at the top where it says next to the microphone, the green microphone. You can raise your hand there. But I'll read what Jane typed in. Jane Sherman said, "Hi, I'm Jane Sherman, ex-FAO, nutrition education consultant. I'm struggling to produce a PowerPoint presentation on how governments should choose the right balance of strategies for nutrition in the UN Decade of Action for Nutrition, driving me crazy." Let me see if there's anybody else reporting in what they're up to or reading. Looks like some people are still typing. Tom says, "I'm working with FH on a cluster randomized control trial in Uganda testing whether treating maternal depression improves maternal behavior change and child growth, and testing a new early child education development model, education cascade groups with PCI." Oh, Terry Laura's mic isn't working. She says, "Sorry, the mic isn't working, but I am Terry Laura, health advisor with Compassion." Hi, Terry. "I am working on short videos on health topics, and the most current is on Nudge," and that's the book she's reading. So, somebody's got the mic. Can you hear?
Julie, can you hear me?
Hi, Julie. You're kind of quiet, but I can
Go for it.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. So lately I've been working. I just finished up working on an article for Field Exchange, a nutrition publication on how we use care groups in emergencies in South Sudan, and like what we did with working in transient populations with the care group model, and how we used kind of like an open structure where people kind of went back and forth between care groups as they moved for flooding and for conflict. Yeah, so just finished writing that up, and it should be out in the next Field Exchange edition, I think coming out in the next week or two.
Great, that's super interesting. So I think I'm going to suggest that folks do keep pasting in the chat the stuff that you're working on, stuff that you're reading. We see another one from Rachel there. Thank you. And I think people are really interested to get going with the presentation. So let's go ahead and jump into the presentation, and then let's revisit at the end, because it's nice to have this turnout, and I find it really inspirational to hear about what other folks are doing in this field. So meanwhile, please go ahead and keep posting in the chat box, and let's get going with our presentation. So today we're going to hear from Elizabeth Long, And Elizabeth is founder of DTA Innovation and has formerly worked as a senior associate with Ideas 42, which is a behavioral consulting firm, and I recommend following them on Twitter. They post some interesting stuff once in a while. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Just to double check, can everyone hear me? Yes, perfect. Wonderful. So thank you everyone for having me. I'm pretty excited to get to talk about one of my passions, which is behavioral economics, which I'll talk about the term behavioral economics compared to behavioral science in a few minutes, and how it can be used within SBC. Definitely not replacing SBC in any way, shape, or form, but how you can start to think about incorporating some of the elements of behavioral economics into your programs. So I'll give a really brief introduction. Sometimes it's hard to present on behavioral economics or behavioral science because there's a very different baseline knowledge of it. So some of you may already know the first couple of slides and some of it, and some of you it may be a little bit new. So for those of you who have heard it before, please bear with me. Then we'll talk about the overlap and the synergies between SBC, BCC, IEC, SBCC. You know, there's been a lot of discussions on the core group meeting boards lately around, you know, what are some of the better terms to use. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to use the term SBC, and with the understanding that that can be interpreted in multiple ways. Then I'll work through an example of how you can incorporate behavioral science into some of the SBC programs using HC3's framework. So I didn't want to design this presentation so that you're convinced that you really need to absolutely use behavioral science in your programs. What I wanted to do was talk about how you can start to think about including it in your programs, since it is something new and it does have a lot to add to existing programs. And then so we'll actually work through an example talking about malaria prevention. So first of all, what is behavioral science? So this exercise works really well when we're all in a room together and everyone can hear each other's answers, but I wanted to do it, I still wanted to do it even though you guys can't hear each other. So the objective of this is when you see a color, when you see a shape, just say what the color is. So for example, think in your head right now what color this is, and you would say blue. And then when you go to the next slide, it's purple. So I'm going to flip through a couple slides, and in your head, just call out or even say aloud the color that you see on the screen. So we went blue, this is purple, yellow, red, black. And what happens is when we get to this one, everyone says blue. But the answer, the color you see on the screen is actually red. And this is an example, I believe it was Mary who's reading the book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, is we have these two parts of our brains. We have what we call System 1 and System 2. And System 1 takes over with sort of automatic thinking. And this is an example of automatic thinking. We say blue because our brain processes the word faster than it processes the color. Essentially what happens is our brain gets tricked. It sees the color blue, it sees the color red, but it reads the word blue. And then we have this System 2, which is the much slower, it's deliberative thought. It takes effort to go into System 2. It takes mental energy. And because of that, we rely on this System 1 thinking. And that's what makes humans, as we like to say in behavioral economics, irrational. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the word irrational. So irrational is a traditionally economic word. It's a word that is meant to describe non-rational behavior. And it doesn't have a value judgment to it. I think a lot of times when people hear the word irrational, they think there's a value judgment, that someone is not thinking logically, is not thinking well. But in economics, the core of this word is simply that they're not following consistent logic patterns. So the term irrational, when we say irrational behavior, again, it doesn't have a judgment on it. It simply means that our brain is tricking us into doing things that we're not necessarily expecting, that we have these cognitive biases or behavioral biases. And so this is a good example of this picture. So depending on the person, you can see a duck, or you can see a rabbit, or you can see both depending on where you look. If you look at the bill, you tend to see a duck. If you look at the right side, you tend to see a rabbit. And this is our brain tricking us. It's filling in information and it's making a choice. And there's this wonderful comic that I hope you guys can all see, where there's these two armies and they both have the exact same flag, but one is the duck army and one is the rabbit army. And the reason I wanted to highlight this slide was simply a reminder that we have these biases in our head. You see a duck or you see a rabbit, and then that sticks with you. And then that can become entrenched. But at the end of the day, you made a false judgment in the beginning because of this behavioral bias, and you never correct it. So another really good example of a behavioral bias is something called defaults. And the individual who is reading the book Nudge has a lot of these examples in it. So going back to this idea that, you know, thinking is sometimes difficult. We go with the first thing that comes to mind. We say blue even though the color is red. So this is what happens when there's default behavior. So this example is looking at organ donation rates in various European countries. And you can see there's the 4 countries on the left that have very, very low organ donation rates. And then there's the 7 countries on the right that have very high organ donation rates. And the only difference between these countries, in addition to the fact that they're different countries, is the fact whether they have a default or an opt-in for organ donation. So you can compare Germany, that has a rate of 12%, and Austria, which has a rate of 99.98%. The culture of Germany and Austria is very, very similar. But if you look at their organ donation rates, you see this huge difference. And so the conclusion is that, well, it's really the fact that it's this default behavior. Going through the effort to fill out forms to either sign up to become an organ donation, that's difficult, or to opt out to become an organ donor, that is also difficult. So because of those hassle factors, because of those difficulties, what we as humans do is we just follow the default behavior. Not only is it the hassle factor, but it also sends us a signal that this is what other people are doing. If organ donation is the default, then we just follow that social norm. Now there's a couple other examples. One of my favorite examples is talking about what happens when you go to the grocery store hungry. So when I go to the grocery store hungry, I have no idea how. I always walk into the grocery store with the intention of being very healthy and buying vegetables and fruits and, you know, the makings of a good solid healthy dinner with protein and various food groups. And somehow when I get home, I look in my bag and I unpack my groceries and I have chocolate ice cream and I have cookies and I have chips and I have snacks and I have many, many things, but I don't have anything that I can actually sit down and make and cook for dinner. And this is an example of what we call the HotCold Empathy Gap. If you have the intention to do something, but when you're in an emotionally charged state, whether that's being hungry, whether that's being tired, whether that's being stressed, you make different decisions. So you make different decisions when you go to the grocery store when you're hungry compared to when you're not hungry. And that's not a good or bad thing. That's simply a behavioral bias. And that's something really important to recognize. One of the examples that I think this is perfect for is thinking about condom use. So people have the intention of using a condom. They absolutely 100% have the intention of using a condom. And they would criticize other people for not using condoms, but there are times when you're in an emotionally heightened state, when you're sexually aroused, where individuals make a very different decision. And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, it's simply how the brain works. We have these cognitive biases where when we are in an emotionally charged state, we have different actions than when we're not. So one of the things that really drew me to behavioral science and behavioral economics was, I was running some programs in Africa. I was living in Tanzania. I was working on HIV/AIDS programs. I was working on nutrition programs. I was doing some evaluation of maternal health programs, and I just kept thinking, if I'm not always going to have perfect behavior, if I'm not always going to eat healthy, if I'm going to go to the grocery store with the intention of eating healthy and then get home and realize that I have junk, how can I be working on a program where I'm assuming that the people in the program are making perfect decisions? And I'm not designing the program around the fact that I am flawed, and because I am flawed with these cognitive biases, that they are also just as flawed. So that's actually what drove me into a lot of the research for behavioral economics many, many years ago, and then thinking about how do you actually apply this in programs. So thinking about just one quick example, which we're going to delve into much later. So if you think about sleeping under a bed net, the individual traditionally think, well, if we give the individual knowledge of the importance of the benefits, of the advantages, of the safety of sleeping under a bed net, then that will lead to them having the intention to sleep under the bed net, and then that will lead to them sleeping under the bed net. And one thing that behavioral economics does is it says, there isn't necessarily this logical chain, and just because there's knowledge, it doesn't lead to intentions, and just because there's intentions, it doesn't lead to sleeping under a bed net. Sometimes you don't have to have knowledge to sleep under the bed net. Sometimes you go straight from knowledge to sleeping without necessarily having an intention. And so I've been using the term behavioral economics, behavioral science, sort of interchangeably. And behavioral economics is the term that is a little more in vogue. You could say it's a little bit more of a popular term right now, and that's simply because of how it's been marketed over the past 5 or 10 years. There's been a lot of really great, really accessible, really wonderful to read books, some of which are Nudge, Scarcity, Thinking Fast and Slow, which isn't quite as accessible to read, but it's still a great book if you have time. So the individuals in this field, the behavioral economists in this field have done a really good job of marketing their section and their aspects of the work. And so because of it, frequently the field can be referred to as behavioral economics as a whole. And organizations like USAID also have picked up the term behavioral economics, but it's actually broader than that. So the term behavioral science encompasses behavioral economics, and then it also encompasses psychology and anthropology. It draws on the fields of sociology and then decision science, as well as health communication. There's a lot of work that's been done in global health and domestic health that then has informed behavioral science and sociology and anthropology and psychology in general. So let's see, I was just reading the comments to see if there was anything to address right now. And so one thing I do want to stress is that behavioral science, it's very evidence-based. These are very rigorous fields. And the academic research that's been done in these fields by behavioral economists, by psychologists, sociologists, by all of these individuals, it is very rigorous. And more recently, they've been doing randomized controlled trials to actually not only test the fact that these behavioral biases exist in the U.S. as well as in developing countries. There's an institute in Busara in Kenya that really tests the fact that these behavioral biases exist in this low-income African setting, but also the tools on how to overcome some of these biases in psychology, sociology. They're also been very rigorously tested. So this is a slide that maybe some of you have seen. It's a modification of a slide that has been around for a couple years off the Berry website, which is a Behavioral Economics and Reproductive Health Institute. I think I just butchered that name. I apologize for that. But it's an institute at University of California, Berkeley. It's part of the SIGA Institute, which is a group of development economists as well as other individuals who are working in the development field. And so they have this one part of the organization that really focuses on how to bring behavioral economics into some of the work. And the reason I really want to stress this slide is because I think when behavioral economics started moving into the global health field, it was marketed in some ways as a solution, as to replace SBC, to kind of redo it. But I really want to stress that that's not the case. Behavioral economics is one tool in the toolbox that we have. And as you can see from this slide, there's a lot of overlap. SBC programs have actually been doing behavioral science for many years without it being called behavioral science. Things like reframing information, harnessing social norms, utilizing social proof in order to change behavior, harnessing emotions to try to change behavior. Those are parts of behavioral science, but they're also things that SBC teams have been doing for many years. And there's even some other aspects of behavioral science that some organizations, some global health organizations have been using. So I just want to stress that behavioral science is not meant to replace BCC. It's simply a way to augment it and have some more tools. So some of the things that are behavioral science interventions, some of the things that are tools, are thinking about how to optimize timing of information that's provided. We're all overburdened. We're constantly getting information. In the U.S. there's Twitter and all of these, different things, and overseas there's also rapidly growing information sources. And so one thing behavioral science does is think about how to optimize the timing so that when you get information, you're actually processing it. We think about reframing obstacles. So that's changing the structure of the situation in which the person's making a decision. We can create commitment devices, which is how you can encourage, you can put yourself in the place of your future self, and that future self can commit to doing something, and that actually ends up increasing the likelihood that you follow through on a behavior. We can simplify decision making for individuals, which is job aids, which has actually been done a lot recently in SBC and even more historically as well. And then we can also use the power of defaults. We saw the slide about organ donation, so changing structures potentially to utilize the power of defaults is one option. And obviously we can't make a lot of health behavior default, but there are some cases where we might be able to use it. And so then there's a smaller bubble at the bottom, which in terms of, it's not less important, that's not why it's smaller, it's simply that it didn't quite fit on the slide, is this HCD, which is human-centered design. So I wanted to make sure that this was on the slide to remind all of us here on the call about the importance of designing programs using the feedback and potentially co-designing with the actual individuals who are in that situation. So thinking about using personas to build empathy when you're actually designing programs, as opposed to saying, this is a very top-down approach. So that's one thing which is also becoming more common in the field of behavioral economics. And I think, okay, excuse me, I think there's a slide missing, but we'll just skip to that. So getting actually into the nitty-gritty. So this is HC3's a toolkit for how to design an SBCC strategy, kind of the highest level of the 7 steps. And what I was asked to do was to talk a little bit about where behavioral economics can fit into this overall strategy. Now, the consulting firms, the organizations that are currently doing behavioral science interventions, organizations like the Behavioral Insights Team, BIT, which is out of the British government, and then it branched out and it's now doing a lot of global work as well. There's organizations like Ideas 42, my former employers. There's organizations like Grid Impact, which is combining human-centered design, and it's also combining behavioral scientists, so the teams have both elements. There's the Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is a name that I absolutely love. So there's the Center for Advanced Hindsight, and as well as Common Sense, which are applied research labs out of Duke University with Dan Ariely, who's written a couple books on irrational behavior as well, and is a leading thinker and researcher in this field. So all of these organizations have their own strategies, and they're all very, very similar in terms of how they approach projects. So I'm not going to talk about the specific of that, but instead what I'm going to do is talk about how you can take some of that methodology and think about incorporating it into how we as SBCC strategists tend to create programs. And the majority of the work falls in steps 1 and 2, which is really analyzing the situation, understanding the situation, doing the formative research, getting a sense of how to then design the program and prototyping, as well as step 2, which is thinking about your audience. And just as you can do segmentation on BCC strategies, you can also do segmentation with behavioral science strategies. Let's see. So I'm going to work through a situation of a very crude work through of thinking about why people are still getting malaria. So creating kind of a root diagram as HC3 recommends you do. So thinking about why people are still getting malaria, there can be standing water near the compound. And if you think about drilling down a little further, it's because people aren't clearing the water around their house, around their compound. It's because people are not sleeping under bed nets. And drilling down on that, it could be that they don't have a bed net, or they don't know the benefits of sleeping under a bed net. It could also be that people aren't seeking care within 24 hours. So there's high prevalence and there's high transmission. Drilling down on that, it's because the clinic is far away and it's hard to get to the clinic, so people aren't going to the clinic. Or it could be that they don't really understand the benefits of going to the clinic or going to the clinic within 24 hours, and maybe alternatively they're using traditional medicines, or they're simply giving paracetamol or kind of a drug that they buy in the pharmacy, but not necessarily a drug that's treating malaria. Alternatively, they could be not taking the full course of the medication that's offered, the ACT, and one reason behind that is that they could not understand the benefits of doing that. So thinking about some very, very, very basic, again, this is kind of a very basic example. Thinking about some of the solutions that we could use, and these are all traditional solutions that have been employed. We can have a spraying campaign to help deal with the fact that there's standing water and to kill the mosquitoes as they're breeding and to kill their larvae. We can provide bed nets in a campaign. That eliminates the fact that people don't have bed nets. We can do an education campaign, and maybe the education campaign is interpersonal communication. Maybe it's a radio message. Maybe it's sort of dramas. Thinking about the distance to the clinics, what we can do is train community health workers in the use of rapid diagnostic tests as well as ACT, and that eliminates the need for people to travel distances. Thinking about the benefits, we can also do an education campaign along the lines of the importance of seeking care within 24 hours, as well as the importance of taking the full course of medication and not stopping once individuals feel a little better. Now, let's think about what some of the behavioral biases that could be, which may not be identified in terms of traditional approaches. So one thing to think about is something that I call limited attention. So behavioral science asks the question, there's all these obvious causes, such as not having a bed net and things along those lines, but what are these cognitive biases? What is the brain doing that's causing there to be a gap between the intention to do something and the action to do something? So in this case, standing water. And so we're thinking about inattention We all have lots of things on our minds. You know, it's been a long day. I've been in the fields. I've been working a lot. I've been harvesting. I come back and there's just, you know, many things on my mind. And I just literally don't see the standing water near my house. And this is something that we all do. You know, you just don't notice change when it's in a familiar environment. You don't notice that that small little puddle has gotten a little larger and it's gotten a little larger. And because we don't notice it, it's not something that we think about taking any action on. There could be a lack of social proof. It could be that I see water around my compound. I see water in front of my house, but I see it in front of other people's houses too. So that creates this idea of, what's the point of me cleaning if other people aren't cleaning, because the mosquitoes will breed over there. And it also creates this uncertainty in your mind about the benefits of removing the standing water. Because you can think, well, you know, maybe there was this new bit of information, because if the other people aren't cleaning, then maybe someone told them not to clean, and I don't need to clean now. And that uncertainty, that disconnect between what you thought you knew and what you're observing other people do, that uncertainty means that you're not going to take action. And also, chances are you don't want to ask, because nobody likes asking a question where they think that other people already know the answer to it. So that uncertainty in itself, that lack of social proof, can cause people to not take action. Procrastination. I don't know about you, but I occasionally procrastinate on many things in my life on a daily basis. And it could be that someone says, you know, I see the water, but I'm going to deal with it tomorrow. And I'm tired today, I'll just deal with it tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes and they say, you know, I'm just going to deal with it tomorrow. But meanwhile, they've done this a couple days in a row, and the mosquitoes have bred, and the timing is now off. You know, the point of cleaning the water is now no longer valid. So procrastination is a huge element as well. And we should not underestimate just the fact that cleaning takes effort. We're all busy at the end of a long day. Cleaning is a hassle factor. And it's something that you have to, you know, you sit down and then you have to go, you know, potentially get a brush, potentially get a rake, do something along those lines, to then do one more thing when you already have a to-do list that is, you know, 10 miles long. You've gone and gotten water, you've harvested, you've done all these other things. And so cleaning takes effort at the end of the day. And these typically are not traditional ways to think about behavior. So what are some of the tools that we can then use in order to address these behavioral biases that we have identified? Someone's mic is on and it's a little distracting. Oh, someone's mic is now off. Thank you for that. So let's think about limited attention. So sometimes some national malaria control programs have individuals that walk around and point out, oh, you know, your compound is dirty, there's standing water here, you should clean it. And that's great, it's a good tool, but that can also be a bit of an annoying tool, you know, in terms of no one likes being told that their compound is dirty. No one likes having that criticism of, you know, you're the one who needs to clean more. So instead of doing something along those lines, and instead of, you still want to find a way to have that person break their lack of concentration, break their lack of attention around the water. And so this idea of, you know, scheduling it. So on Mondays, everyone knows Monday is the day we have to clean. Monday and Thursday, those are the days we have to do our cleaning. And having someone potentially remind you, not telling you that you have to clean up a specific area, not sort of having that negative interaction, but instead saying, you know, remember you need to clean today. So thinking of a lack of social proof, providing social comparisons. This is something that is very common, particularly in electricity usage. If any of you have or have recently lived in California, PG&E has put these energy comparisons on electricity bills for years. So you actually see what other people's electricity usage is, and there's been a lot of studies that have shown that actually changes your electricity usage. And I think Given this audience, I don't need to convince you of the power of social proof. And then, so procrastination, how do you deal with something like procrastination? This is also actually potentially a similar tool to limited attention. You set reminders. So it's not that someone says, I'm going to clean tomorrow. It's that someone says, I know I need to clean today. Everyone cleans today. It's Monday. Monday is cleaning day. So by creating that moment in your brain where you clean on a Monday, that then leads to less procrastination. Oh yes, Tom Davis, especially when there's a happy or sad face used on the information for energy uses. Yes, that is actually a real study, and that is very true. So jumping to the last cognitive bias is cleaning takes effort. There are non-monetary incentives, simple things like certificates. Giving everyone a certificate, you know, at the beginning of the rainy season that says, I have a clean compound. And using an idea called loss aversion. So loss aversion is a cognitive bias that we have, which says that we feel a loss stronger than we feel a gain. So if you give someone a certificate and take it away, that's actually a more powerful motivator than if you say, if you do something, you will get this certificate. Because once you have the certificate, you don't want to lose it. So thinking about a very small certificate to say, you know, I have a clean compound, that's something that you can provide to individuals. And because they wouldn't want to lose that certificate, that could be a way to have them mentally overcome some of the hassle factors of cleaning. This idea of using non-monetary incentives to encourage behavior, and you know, very, very small non-monetary incentives was used in a randomized trial in India looking at incentivizing immunization by giving out a very, very small bag of lentils. And that little extra incentive really increased immunization rates across the board. So thinking about the next behavior. So we've talked about some behavioral biases and then some tools that we can use to think about how to encourage cleaning environments in some potentially non-traditional SBC ways. So let's jump to another behavior, which is not sleeping under a bed net. And we'll go through 4 examples for cognitive biases that can lead to a gap between the intention to sleep under a bed net and the action of actually going through and actually sleeping under it. So we talked a little bit about this before, hassle factors. So hassle factors, it could be that you missed the campaign to get a bed net, or it could be that your bed net broke, or you burned it with a candle, and you now need to go to the effort of getting a new bed net. And it could be that the bed net's free. Frequently, bed nets are given out as part of antenatal care or as part of immunization campaigns for children under 5. So it's some small effort that you need to go through to get the bed net. But again, that small effort means you have to plan for that effort. It means you have to find a day to do it. And so that hassle factor in and of itself can prevent you from getting that bed net. So HotCold Empathy Gap. This is what I talked about before with going to the grocery store hungry. You have the intention of eating healthy, but somehow the moment that you're making the decision the moment you're making the decision of what food to buy, you're in a different emotional state. And because you're in a different emotional state, you're making a different decision than what your intention had been before. So thinking about this in terms of sleeping under a bed net, you have the intention of sleeping under a bed net. You know the advantages. You know it prevents mosquitoes from biting you. You even prefer it because the mosquitoes aren't buzzing in your ear in the night. But you get home, you're tired, you're hot, it's been a long day, you've been harvesting all day. You get home and because it's hot, we all know that sleeping under a bed net is hot. You're already in this slightly different emotional state because you're hot, because you're tired, and that in that moment you're making a different decision because you have to take the action in a moment when you're hot and tired, as opposed to before when you were saying, yes, of course I'll sleep under a net. So this emotionally charged state can lead to you not sleeping under a bed net. There's a broad range of what we refer to as mental models, which are kind of heuristics you have or ideas you have in your head of things that you believe are true. We call those mental models in behavioral science. So frequently with bed nets, you have this mental model that the bed net is scratchy, maybe that the medication gives you a rash. You know, the medicine that is in the bed net might give you a rash. And because you've had this idea in your head for a while, it's something that's difficult to change. It's a belief that's difficult to change. So maybe you get a new bed net and someone tells you, oh, this is a new bed net, it won't give you a rash, or it's made from a different material so it won't be scratchy. But you still have this existing mental model in your head and nothing's been done to change that mental model. You know, sometimes simply stating a fact is not going to change someone's belief that they have and that they've held for a long period of time. Now, also, one behavioral bias for not using a bed net is what we call optimism bias. You can see the glass half full or half empty perspective. So this is common across many, many health issues where it's the idea of I'm not going to get sick. You know, other people might contract malaria. You know, other people might get lung cancer if they smoke. Other people might have a heart attack if they don't eat healthy. But I'm not. That's not going to happen to me. And so this is a common bias that you can even apply to something like sleeping under a bed net because it's this idea of, well, you know, I didn't get malaria last year, so I'm not going to get malaria this year because it's not going to happen to me. So thinking of some tools that we can then use to potentially overcome some of the 4 biases that I've talked about. There's this idea again of recognition or non-monetary incentives. So using some type of very, very small non-monetary incentive in order to get someone to go through the effort of getting a new bed net. Thinking of how do you overcome this hot-cold empathy gap? One way to potentially do that is to use defaults. So if the bed net is already down, if there isn't the amount of effort that you have to go through in order to put the bed net down at night, if you don't have to make that decision in the moment, if the decision is already made for you by a default, that is one way to overcome the hot-cold empathy gap. And it may not be realistic in this case to design a bed net that is down and that is you know, safe and isn't going to be damaged if it's down, but it is something to think about in terms of how do we think about designing, you know, designing a physical product with humans in mind? How do we use human-centered design to actually redesign something like a bed net, which, if, you know, to be perfectly honest, bed nets are not exactly the best invention in terms of humans because they're hot and they're annoying to sleep under. Even I've never heard someone disagree with those facts. But how can you design it in such a way so that the default is that the bed net is down, and maybe this is an issue of you know, potentially using screens instead of bed nets or something along those lines, but changing the situation so that the default behavior is actually the behavior that you're trying to encourage. Thinking about mental models, there's the potential to use things like social proof, which is people being able to see that other people are following that behavior, or other people are talking about the fact that the net is not giving them rashes, the net is not hurting their skin, things along those lines, and using iterative learning process, so iterative learning games. And then what's a tool to deal with optimism bias? So I specifically left a question mark here because there's 2 elements to behavioral science that are very important. One is that we have all these tools, and in some cases it may or may not be easy to match a tool to a behavioral bias. You know, if there's limited attention, you can work with things like reminders, you know, you can work with things like social proof, but not all behavioral or cognitive biases have solutions. And that is a huge area where there needs to be potential improvement, and that's also a huge area where human-centered design is going to play a very, very important role. How can we design new tools that are not simply, education campaigns, that are not simply, distribution campaigns, that are not simply text message reminders. So this aspect of human-centered design will, I think, very much inform behavioral science and then also SBC interventions moving forward. So this very beautiful diagram is an example of many, but not all, of the cognitive biases that behavioral scientists think about when we go through a problem like this. So for sleeping under a bed net, I identified 4 potential behavioral biases that were at play, and then also for not cleaning your environment, I also kind of highlighted 4. But there are many, many behavioral and cognitive biases to consider. And some of these come more from the behavioral economics, some of them come more from the psychology, some from the anthropology, but this is the thought process that we go through, even though the majority of the time there's sort of a smaller subset that are frequently used in terms of identifying some of these intention action gaps. So nudging. So one of you is reading the book Nudge, which is wonderful. It's a really great read for anyone who's interested in the subject. But what I wanted to highlight quickly is that the term nudge is frequently used to refer to any behavioral science intervention, and that's not necessarily true. Some are not quite classic nudges. But what I really wanted to focus on is this idea that a nudge is a tool, a nudge is a solution. And so you can have a nudge, but in order to apply a nudge, you have to understand what the cause is. You have to understand what the behavioral bias is. You can't just apply a nudge sort of haphazardly or randomly and saying, oh, I like this nudge, I like this idea of defaults, I'm going to apply it to this solution and I think it's going to work. And I think in this audience that is probably very well understood that not every tool in your toolkit of SBC interventions is appropriate for every behavior change issue. But it is something that I think a lot of people talk about the tools around behavioral science instead of talking about the behavioral biases. And if you're not identifying some of these behavioral biases, then your intervention and whatever tool you're going to throw at it probably is not going to work. And then there is some criticism that nudging is about manipulating people, but that's not the case at all. Nudging, providing new options or encouraging defaults, things along these lines, it's not changing choice, it's not eliminating choice. And it's the same thing as providing education campaigns. You're structuring the situation so that the person can make a healthy behavior, but at the end of the day, if they don't want to sleep under a bed net, you're not forcing them to. You're not forcing them to sleep under the bed net. You're not forcing them to clean their environment. You're absolutely not taking away choice. So one thing that I really hope I stressed, and I'm happy to talk more about individuals offline, is this idea that behavioral science is one additional set of tools, but that SBC in and of itself is doing a lot of really interesting work, and it's simply a new lens. It's a new lens to look at some of these problems, and thinking about cognitive biases allows us to think about some potentially different ways to bridge this gap between intention and action. The field is rapidly expanding right now, particularly in global health, which is really wonderful. It's great in the sense that, in the next 5 or 10 years, there's going to be a much greater evidence base around some of the tools, and then how they can be applied in different situations, which is really, really great. So I'm going to open it up to questions. So Tom Davis asked, what tools help one to determine which behavioral biases may be at play for a given behavior? So that is not necessarily a question with an easy answer. So it's a process when you go through, you're doing qualitative research, formative research, similar to what you would do when you're thinking about how to design a traditional SBC program. And you're doing this research and you're attempting to identify some of the behavioral biases that you think may be at play. So you're asking people questions around the behavioral biases. You're asking them about their feelings, about the situation, about what they're thinking about, when they're thinking about it, about when they're making a decision to do something, when they're actually taking the action to do it. You're looking at the context in which they're making a decision. Is it in a clinic? Is it in a home? Is it in a waiting room? And how that environment might influence their decision-making behavior. So there isn't necessarily a good tool to say, if the individual is doing something, then this behavioral bias is at play. That is not something that is yet out there, to be perfectly frank. And I don't think, at the moment, I don't think there's a lot of effort to create something like that, which is one of my bigger frustrations with the field is how do you help people identify behavioral biases on their own? That level of capacity building I don't think has happened yet, and given the fact that there's a lot of consulting firms working in the area, I'm not quite sure to what extent that will become available in the next few years. Dan Ariely has some publicly available resources for helping identify some of the behavioral biases, and I think he's probably the best bet for someone to move that forward. So it is still guesswork. You're absolutely true, Tom. So it is guesswork in the sense that you're identifying it, but then you're identifying it and you're doing research. So you have a hypothesis. You think, I think that this behavioral bias may be at play, and then you're doing some research, you're talking with people, you're interacting with people, you're observing them. And so that then provides evidence for whether your original guesswork is right or not. So this isn't a single process. This should really be an iterative process. I'm working on one project right now, and we did the initial 2 weeks of research, and now we're going back actually next week to do some prototyping, but also to do additional research to confirm or negate some of our original behavioral hypotheses. And then we'll also do a third round. It's a well-funded project, which is wonderful, but you should be constantly thinking about this iterative process of constantly trying to confirm or refute some of your hypotheses around which behavioral biases are at play. So there's a question asking about how much of BE tools and research methods are proprietary. So unfortunately, the majority of them, I think, are right now. Ideas 42 has their methodology, which is very much proprietary. BIT doesn't have, so, BIT has World Bank has some, Dan Ariely's group has some, and there's not a lot of public information out there at the moment, unfortunately. In terms of capacity building, this is something that I'm trying to figure out how to put something like this out there in the public domain, particularly because SBC individuals are already so well versed in a lot of this. I think it would be a very short jump to train a lot of SBC individuals in this. In some fields like development or agriculture, it's a little bit more of a leap, but particularly in the global health field, I feel like the capacity building around behavioral economics is huge. But at the moment, the research methods are still officially proprietary. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to address some of the other questions. How can the challenge? So I think in terms of how can the challenge be managed, of the fact that there is this information that is proprietary, my best recommendation is when you're working with individuals to who are working you through some of these BSI methodologies to essentially work with them and to encourage them to work with you as opposed to kind of do it as like a black box type project where you're not actually sure what's happening, particularly because I think in SBC there's so much knowledge out there and there's so much expertise that doing any projects as in a very, very collaborative way with anyone that you bring in is really crucial in making sure that you end up getting a solution that makes sense for your context. We may be running out of questions.
A bit in your response to Tom, but just wondering, how different do you feel like that they look in behavioral science versus a more traditional SBC sort of intervention, or do they look that different? Thank you.
Sorry, I missed, I believe, the beginning of the question.
So you started to address this a little bit with the project you're currently working on, but can you talk a little bit about how monitoring and evaluation of an intervention based on behavioral economics approaches or based on trying to reduce behavioral biases or address them is different from a
So in terms of kind of the long-term part of a project, in terms of the long-term M&E, that is very similar. Frequently, at the moment at least, a lot of behavioral science tools are run as shorter-term, more clinical trial interventions. So they fit outside the box a little bit of actual kind of long-term program implementation. But in terms of being able to assess the effectiveness of the program, you can do it the exact same way. So you can have a SBC program that has traditional elements as well as behavioral, as well as some new behavioral science elements, and then you would implement and monitor the program in the same way as you would if you didn't have the BSI elements in it. Does that answer the question?
Adapting these approaches or insights for across the program lifecycle, I think is another important area that we could be working on together. So there's a couple more questions, or another question from Amy Ostrander. Maybe you could take that one next, Elizabeth.
Yes, so my thoughts about sharing information on some of the biases with participants or beneficiaries themselves. So that's a really great question. And so what has been found is even if you tell someone that they're going to make a decision that is different when they're hungry, that doesn't actually stop them from doing it. So I know perfectly well, and again, I'm a very flawed human being. I know perfectly well that if I go to the grocery store hungry, I'm going to make bad decisions about what I buy. And the reality is that I still do that, even though I know perfectly well that it's a cognitive bias. There are days when I'm able to kind of, have more structure and say, okay, I'm going to make a list and I'm going to stick with my list, or okay, I'm going to eat a snack before going to the grocery store so I'm not hungry when I'm in the grocery store. But frequently just informing someone of the cognitive biases actually doesn't end up changing their behavior. What you really need to do is think about how to give them something like a implementation plan. There's something called mental contracting or implementation intentions, MCII, which is this idea that you can work someone through a process where in a calm state, they can come up with solutions about what they'll do when they hit a specific hurdle. So if you know you're hungry, you can sit down and say, I know if I go to the grocery store right now, I'm going to make bad decisions about what I buy. But you have to work that person through that process as opposed to just saying, you're going to make bad decisions if you go to the grocery store hungry. Knowledge about cognitive biases doesn't prevent them from from occurring. Let's see. So Tom has a comment about of the biases he shared. Under 179 were listed. Yes, that is absolutely true. There are a huge number of behavioral biases. And I completely agree with you that sort of a small group of individuals to kind of focus on some of these key the key biases that tend to be most common, particularly in different settings, to then be able to do the formative research. I completely agree with that. And you're right in the sense that some of it is fascinating, but it's not necessarily actionable. That is also, I think, a big flaw. And some of the human-centered design elements, I think, also takes it from fascinating to actionable, even though that's not always part of programs. But the human-centered design elements, I think, helps people think outside of the box in how to deal with some of these biases that don't have obvious tools, in order to fix them.
Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'm just going to throw out a question to participants, just because I think I see that we have a lot of great SBCC thinkers and practitioners on the call. So I'm just wondering, what, in the folks participating on the call, in your world, are people having conversations about behavioral economics? Do people, is there a demand, is there a desire to kind of bridge this gap a little bit and bring in insights and approaches from behavioral economics? Or is it more like, anyway, how is this like showing up in your world, I guess is my question. I'd love it if anybody would be willing to.
I could start. This is Mary. I am hearing a lot of people who are very interested in it, and then there's a little bit of back and forth, like, is this a little bit, of kind of old wine and new wineskins, or an new wine and old wineskins. I think I get that analogy backwards. Like, is this kind of just a reframing of stuff that we've been looking at in the past? So people are, there's a little skepticism, and then there's a lot of excitement about it, but again, that frustration of how do we apply it. I've been interested in just looking for little bitty insights that might help you, like sometimes things can be set up so that it's just easier to do something. Sometimes we unknowingly and unintentionally set up something so it's harder than it needs to be for community members. So just taking some of these insights in mind, maybe we'll kind of begin to find ways, but the frustration for me also has been like, how do you take this from interesting and quite fascinating into actionable information. Looks like Tom has written something in there.
Right. So Tom, yeah, sure. So Tom's mentioning that some of the stuff is new, is not all old wine, and I think we all agree with that, and why it's important to have the conversation. So he says, for example, the availability heuristic is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that have greater availability in our memory. And so how available it is in our memory is influenced by whether it's emotional or how recent they are. And so having a new story in an intervention about an actual child who died, thanks, Tom, actually can get people to think, oh, this does happen commonly around here, because that memory will be more accessible at the top of their mind. Jones?
I think a perfect example.
Yeah, go for it.
Is shark attacks. Shark attacks are actually very uncommon, but they're horrifying and they're emotionally charged. So people actually think that shark attacks are likely, and unless you live on a beach in Western Australia, you're not going to get attacked by a shark. But this is pure availability heuristic because of the emotions and because of a movie called Jaws, and people dramatically overestimate the likelihood of shark attacks. Or exactly, Tom, attacked by refugees. It's the same idea. It's an emotionally charged situation where because you can an idea or an example comes to mind quickly, you overestimate the likelihood, you overestimate its prevalence.
And then Joan says that her frustration has been with how less than humanitarian marketing appropriates so much of this research. So is that maybe sort of the way that Coke, for example, or something applies behavioral economics to their marketing? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of, Joan? Yeah.
Yes, and firms are absolutely now using behavioral scientists more and more so in order to get you to continue buying products. And some of them are very open. Jet, which is like an online realtor similar to Amazon, they absolutely admit that your spending habits, that they try to get you hooked on products. And Amazon does the same with their little push buttons that make it easy for you to order without actually having to order. They 100% use behavioral economics to get you to buy more, and it is a bit disconcerting and appalling. But such as any tool can be used for positive as well as not so positive ways, and I hope that in the social good, in the social services world, we figure out how to utilize some of the benefits of it without ever kind of going down the path of using it in not so good ways.
For their marketing interventions is kind of raises the question of resources also, because it seems like I know that we don't maybe have evidence of this, but it seems like some of these approaches can be pretty resource intensive, or at least hiring people who can apply these insights can be resource intensive. But I like your optimism, Elizabeth, about moving forward and doing a lot of social good as well with this. So do we have any final questions for Elizabeth before we move on? See, a couple people are typing here, so let's see.
So I did just want to say, if anyone has any kind of questions or just general interest in the field and wants more information, I'd be more than happy to talk with you offline over the next couple of weeks to kind of guide you in how you can think more, how you can learn more about this field. My email is there, and hopefully I'll also be at the core group meeting in April, I believe it is. But yeah, feel free to reach out and just ask any questions you have.
So now that we are, Mary, go ahead with the work plan update. Sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, we just had a couple more items, so please don't leave yet. Just a quick update on our work plan for this year, which is has a lot of boxes checked off in the completed column, so it feels really good, and thank you guys for being a part of that. One thing that we have outstanding is that for the last few years, actually, a smaller group of us on the task force have been working at coming up with some guidance around the costing and timing of formative research. Because as we all know, when you're trying to build formative research into a program, or maybe even to do formative research midway through, when you realize, oh, something's not working the way we thought it would, the first question from managers is, how much is it going to cost and how much time is it going to take? And we know that those questions aren't always so easy to answer. So we've been working on a short guidance document Thanks, Jean. It's not so much research at this point as guidance, but so what we've discovered is it's actually quite challenging to get, we really did try for a while to get actual costing data from projects to kind of compare across formative research methods and things. But what we found is that it's quite difficult to do that because of the way, because of the way our accounting works. These things are split across different budget line items, and there's turnover, so there isn't the institutional memory to really pull all that together. So where we've kind of landed with this is a short guidance document that really just looks at what are the cost centers. What are the cost centers you should be thinking about if you're planning to do some formative research? What does a typical sort of budget look like? What are the factors that are going to influence the budget? So what are the factors that are going to influence how long it's going to take? Different methods take different amounts of time. If you're exploring more, multiple behaviors, that's going to take more time and resources. And so, what are those factors that are going to impact timing and costing? And then just pointing people to a few good formative research tools, because as we all know, there's so much out there that it can be, we all have this information overload. So that's what this guidance document is kind of evolving into. So basically, what are the cost centers associated with formative research? What are the factors that affect costing and timing? And then where can you go for some good tools to help you plan and carry out some good formative research? So I think we're about ready. Within the next couple of weeks, we should be ready to share a draft. And we'd love to share a draft with a group of folks on the task force who might be willing to review this and give us some feedback. And the document, we're aiming for something 10 pages or so, and a lot of that, a part of that 10 pages being lists of resources, or a list of resources. So that's kind of the size of the ask. So if you're interested, please do raise your hand now or let us know in the chat box if you'd be interested in giving this a look over and giving us feedback on it, because we'd like to get this out as soon as we can, sometime this spring, because we know it's an area that a lot of people would be interested in being able to think through more clearly and give better answers to their bosses, basically. And I think that's the main thing for the work plan. As you know, we do with the core groups, SBC working group, we do a journal club. So if you've been reading interesting stuff and you think other SBC practitioners would like to know about it, please do let us know. And we would love to have another journal club presentation in the near future. So I think that's it. Anything else on the work plan, Mary? And then I think you had a couple of announcements.
I think there's another slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So coming up soon, March 28th through March 31st, we've got a 3.5-day workshop. This is TOPS SBC in partnership with CARE. And I think it should be, we're piloting materials, but we piloted it last year also, so it's not as drafty a draft as it was last year. But seeking to kind of bring together some of the gender issues, gender equity and diversity, with how do you tackle those behaviors through social and behavior change, how do you intervene on some of these issues. And we all had a good time, and the participants really enjoyed it last year, and I think it'll be even stronger this year. So I hope that you'll apply. It's been advertised on the FSN network, but you could also email me if you've got questions about it. Yeah, anyway, so that's coming up, and everybody knows core group is coming up April 20th to 21st, and the theme this year is going to be SBC. So stay tuned and apply. I think the early bird application ends the 8th of this month, March 8th. So yeah, just wanted to make you all aware of that. And thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This was amazing, really great. And do you have any final words, Ashley, or should we just call it a wrap? All set? Alrighty, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. The materials will be on the FSM network in the next couple of days if you would like to spread this meeting recording around and the PowerPoint. So thank you so much for